For those of you who might have gotten here late, our story once again. Oh, princesses, come right on up here. Get a hold of the king's train. For those of you who might have gotten here, oh, come on up. Right up here, there's room for you right on the front on this side. Okay. Well, like I said, our story this year is called The Meister Singers of Nuremberg. And there was one thing that made Nuremberg unique from all the other kingdoms in the world. And that was everybody loves to sing. Well, the king was so proud of this fact that every year on Midsummer Night's Day, the king held a huge singing contest in which people from all over the kingdom would come and sing. And each year the prize was something wonderful. Once it was gold and jewels. Once it was even a small kingdom on the Rhine River. Each year the prize was something wonderful. And the king would traditionally walk into the middle of the village and announce to everybody what it would be. Well, we're just about at that point in our story. But everybody else left out in our audience, guess what? You all are going to be in our show as well. You are all going to have the important role of the citizens of Nuremberg. So when our king comes out here, I want you all to cheer and clap and yell as loud as you all possibly can to show our king just how much you all care and love for him. Do you understand that, guys? Okay, so our story begins as our knight puts the horn to his lips and he blows. And out from the royal palace gates come the knights, one marching right in front of the other. Here we go, knights, one right behind the other, and they march through the village. And as they march through the village, the crowds went wild. All the knights were marching and marching, and they marched all the way back to the line right in front of the castle gates. And they all stood in front of the castle gates as the gates opened again, and out from the gates came the king, followed by all of his princesses. He came right here to the center. He stopped. He turned towards the audience and he lifted his hands up very high, and everybody cheered. The king then addressed the audience. Oh, ladies and gentlemen of the Kingdom of Nuremberg, I know how much you all love me, and I love you too. That is the reason that this year, the winner of the singing contest will win the best prize ever. They will win the hand of one of my beautiful princesses. Wow. Well, then the king added, if the winner happens to be a young lady, she will win the hand of one of my handsome knights. Oh, the ladies loved the sound of that. But then suddenly out from the burg came the burgermeister and Clotilda. They ran up to the king. They put their hand on the king's shoulder and they whispered something into his ear. The king listened. And then he raised his hands and he addressed the audience once more. He said, oh, ladies and gentlemen, there has been one change in the singing rules this year. There will be no dragons allowed to participate. We will call it Chloe's rule. Well, Chloe and the other burgers went back to the burg and they started to celebrate. Oh, they danced in little circles. They gave each other high fives. They all celebrated because everybody knew that Chloe had the most beautiful voice in the entire kingdom, and she would surely win the singing competition now that the dragon of the Black Forest had been forbidden to compete. So the king headed back to his royal palace, right this way, with all the princesses following him. And once he arrived at the castle, he turned around and he started to cry. Oh, and this king cried very loudly. Oh, well, the princesses dropped his robe on the ground and they all gathered around the king. All the princesses gathered around, and the king looked at his princesses and said, oh, princesses, I love you all very much. And this morning I promised the entire kingdom that the winner of the singing contest could marry one of you. Oh, and I love you all very much, and I don't want to lose any of you. So I've come up with a plan. So he gathered all the princesses very close, and knelt down on the ground, and he whispered to each of the princesses, princesses, what I want you to do is I want you to go out into the meadow and practice until you can all sing very beautifully. Then you will all win the singing contest. Then nobody will have to marry anybody. Well, the princesses smiled real big. They loved this idea. So they ran out into the meadow, which is the very center of our carpet here. The king came back to his palace, and the princesses all spread their arms out very wide. And they were ready to start singing and practicing their song when out from the black forest came the skunk. The skunk came running out from the black forest and started to run around the princesses. Oh, well, those princesses had never seen such a cute skunk in their lives. So the princesses started to chase the skunk. Oh, they were chasing that skunk and they were having so much fun. They were trying to catch him. Well, in the meanwhile, the dragon of the black forest was watching the princesses. He hid behind a great big bush. He thought to himself, these princesses, this king wants to make a rule that this dragon is allowed to sing in the singing competition. Well, I will teach him a lesson. So the dragon, in the sweetest voice, yelled to the princesses, "Yoo-hoo, princesses!" The princesses stopped. The dragon jumped from behind the bush, and the princesses all screamed. But they looked into the dragon's eyes, and they were instantly hypnotized. Their eyes got as big as saucers. Their arms went out in front of them like they were sleepwalking, and they went right past the dragon's head, right to his tail. And they picked the dragon's tail up, just as though it was their father's robe. And the dragon headed back to the black forest with all the princesses carrying his tail. And he looked at all the princesses and he said, "Oh, princesses, I hope you all like polishing treasure, because I have lots of treasure for you all to polish." And he led them all back into the black forest. Over there. Well, meanwhile, back at the royal palace, the king was starting to get worried. He yelled to his knights, "Sound the alarm, knights!" The knights gathered around the king. Right over here to the king. Come on over here to the king. And the king looked at his knights and said, "Oh, knights, I haven't seen the princesses all day. I think I know what's going on." And he pointed over here to the burgermeister with his key, and he said, "It's that shifty mayor over in the burg. He wants his daughter Clotilda to win the singing competition. So I bet you he heard my princesses practicing in the meadow and hid them on me. So what I want you to do, knights, is I want you to sneak up on Chloe when she comes out to sing tonight and capture her and bring her back to me." So the knights shook their head yes to the king, and they came right over here and stood behind a couple of trees right over here. And sure enough, that evening, Chloe came running out into the meadow to practice her song. She ran right out of the middle. She spread her arms out very wide, took a deep breath, and was just about ready to start singing her song when out from behind the trees jumped the knights. And the knights all surrounded Clotilda. And Clotilda couldn't go anywhere, so she screamed. Well, the knights took Clotilda by the elbows. And they led her back all the way over to the king. And when they arrived at the castle, the king looked at his knights and said, "Well done, knights. Now I want you to lock Chloe in the tallest tower you can find." And Chloe, that tower happens to be at the top of our third step over here, next to our guardsman. So Chloe was locked all the way over in this tower. And our knights all came back over here with the king. And that evening they had dinner to celebrate their capturing of Chloe. Well, that evening came, and the burger burgermeister started to get worried. He hadn't seen his daughter Clotilda all day. So he came out into the meadow, and he looked up in the air. He looked to the left. He looked to the right. No Chloe anywhere. So finally he looked down on the ground, and on the ground he found footprints. And he followed those footprints all the way over here to the base of the tower, where Chloe had been captured. He looked to the top of the tower, and what did he see waving from the top of the tower? Chloe's fish! Yes, she had that fish waving very high in the air, and she threw that fish down to her father, the burgermeister, who was supposed to catch the fish but left it drop. He picked up the fish, and he looked at the fish and started to inspect it. It looked like Chloe's fish, but he had to make sure, so he took it back to the other burgers. And the rest of the burgers inspected that fish. And they all agreed that it was Chloe's fish. This meant the king had captured Chloe. So the burgermeister said to the other burgers, "Follow me!" So the rest of the burgers followed with the burgermeister, all came towards the palace. They stopped right there. They put their vegetables high in the air and started waving them over at the palace. And they started yelling, "We know you've got Chloe, and we want Chloe back!" Well, the king looked out of his palace and started to chuckle. "You're not going to get Chloe back, but this is what you will get." He opened up his palace gates, and from behind the palace gates came all of the knights. And ladies and gentlemen, this was the beginning of the slow-motion battle of the burgers. And those burgers fought with their vegetables against these brave knights. And this battle raged all day. At once the knights were winning, then the burgers were winning. It raged all through the night, and finally in the morning, the burgers looked at their weapons, and they were starting to get mushy. Ooh. So they had to think of a trick. So the burgers pointed up into the sky, and they yelled to the knights, "Knights, a flying dragon attack!" The knights all looked up in the sky, and as the knights were looking into the sky, the burgers bopped each of the knights on the head with their vegetables. And the knights fell to the ground. Oh, all the knights were falling to the ground. The burgers had been victorious on their battle against the knights. So the burgers started to celebrate. They did their little dances, and they gave each other high fives. But just as they were celebrating, came the worst earthquake in all of Nuremberg history. The ground started to shake. The earth started to tremble. The knights jumped up off the ground, and they started to bounce up and down. Oh, the burgers started to bounce up and down. Clotilda bounced out of her tower back to her father, the burgermeister, right off the tower there. And she started to bounce around. Then the king started to bounce, and he bounced all the way over here as well. Everybody was bouncing up and down and up and down. And finally, out from the Black Forest came the dragon with all the princesses carrying his tail. He came out to the center. He stopped. He let out a great big roar. Everybody was terrified, but the king bravely walked through the group and walked right up to the dragon. He looked the dragon in the face and said, "Oh, dragon, I see that you've got my princesses carrying your tail. Now, what's the meaning of this?" Oh, well, the dragon politely bowed to the king. He said to the king, "Your Majesty, this morning you made a new rule that dragons aren't allowed to sing in the singing competition. Well, I happen to be a dragon who loves to sing. So if you let me sing in your singing competition, I'll unhypnotize your princesses." Ooh, the king had to think about this one. So he scratched his chin and he thought. He looked at all of his princesses, and they were all hypnotized. He only had 5 more minutes till the singing competition was to begin. What would he do? So finally he looked back at the dragon, and he said, "Oh, dragon, you can sing in the singing competition. Just unhypnotize my princesses." So the dragon looked at the princesses. He winked, and they were all unhypnotized. But you know, princesses, you kept carrying that dragon's tail because you became very friendly with that dragon. Oh, the king looked at his robe then, and he said, "Who will carry my robe?" Well, the burghers said, "We will carry your robe." So all the burghers ran over. They took a part of the king's robe, and they started to carry it. The king put his hands high in the air, and he said, "Follow me to the singing competition." So the king, followed by the burghers, followed by the knights, and the dragon with all the princesses, processed that day to the singing competition. And the crowds went wild as the king arrived. The king was waving. And as the king arrived, he turned around and he told everybody, "Everybody, have a seat right on the ground where you're standing." So everybody sat down. The king picked up his robe in his hands, took off his crown, and told everybody, "Write your name on a piece of paper, and I will collect it in my crown." So he went amongst everybody, and he collected everybody's name in his crown. All the burghers, the knights, and finally came over to the dragon, and he collected the dragon's name and all the princesses' names. And that day, everybody in the entire kingdom sang, some very beautifully and some not so beautifully, until there were only 2 names left in the king's crown. The king came over here to the center. He reached into his crown. He pulled out the second to the last name and read, Clotilda. So Clotilda ran over here to the center. But she had forgotten her fish. She can't sing without her fish. So she got over there, and the burgermeister threw her the fish. She almost caught it, then she picked it up. She came right here to the center. She spread her arms out very wide, took a deep breath, and started to sing. But just as she got to her very favorite part in the song, her fish started to wiggle in her hands, and she dropped the fish. She stopped singing. So she picked up the fish. She ran over to the king, and she knelt down on the ground. And she said, "Oh, your majesty, my fish, it slipped." Well, the king looked at Clotilda and said, "Clotilda, I don't believe you." Well, Clotilda picked up her fish and put it in the king's face. The king took the fish from Clotilda and started to inspect the fish. And as he was inspecting that fish, whoa, it slipped right out of his hands, right back into Clotilda's. The king looked at Clotilda and said, "Clotilda, that was a slippery fish. Good catch. You can have one more chance." So Clotilda came back to the center. She spread her arms and started to sing a second time. But this time, the skunk ran out from the forest and remembered that this was the girl that disqualified her friend the dragon from the contest. She wiggled her tail at Clotilda and did what only skunks can do. Oh, Clotilda pinched her nose and she ran out of the circle. And the king looked at the skunk and said, "Oh, skunk, have a seat." So the skunk sat down. The king reached into his crown, this time for the last name. He reached in, he pulled it out, and read, "The dragon." So the dragon stood up, and the princesses all let go of the dragon's tail. And the dragon came right over there to the center. And as he was coming to the center, everybody started to laugh. Look, you can put the dragon's tail down. Thank you, guys. And the dragon looked at all the people, and as he was looking at the people, they all started to laugh at the dragon. Oh, they had never seen such a pathetic-looking dragon. Oh, but the dragon opened up his arms. He took a deep breath, and he started to sing. no one could imagine how magnificent the dragon's voice was. Oh, the audience's mouths dropped open, and they left out a great big gasp. The king put his hand to his head and thought, oh no, if this dragon wins the singing competition, he'll have to marry one of my princesses. Oh, but at that very moment, there was a unicorn sleeping in the forest. The unicorn woke up and heard the dragon's voice. She touched the dragon on his head, and then on his tail, and suddenly off came his head, and off came his tail, and there, singing away, was the most handsome prince anybody had ever seen. Oh, everybody was clapping as the dragon was singing. Oh, what a voice! Well, the king marched over to the dragon, and he shook the dragon's hand, and he said, well done, dragon. Now you must pick one of my princesses to marry. Ah, so all the princesses stood up, and they fixed their hair, and they fixed their gowns, and they were all very beautiful princesses. And the dragon came on over. He looked at all the princesses, and they were all very beautiful. And then his eyes met the eyes of that one princess that he knew would be perfect for him forever. He stepped up to the princess,